Leviticus chapter 18 verse 22 says, "Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable." And then chapter 20 verse 13 says, "If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads." Whew. I understand how brutal and kind of alienating that can sound, especially for people who are gay. They maybe shrink back from that. I get all of the various emotional responses that you might have to that, but I think instead of kind of recoiling from those verses, I think actually if we look at them, try and understand them, then it helps to make sense of what they're actually saying and what they actually mean. So let's do that. First of all though, welcome, I'm Andrew. This is All Things Theology. I kind of want to teach the Bible here and help you understand it and know what it means for your life, so I hope you enjoy it. Now, with these verses in Leviticus, I think it's going to be helpful to look at them from a broad view first as their place in the Bible, then zoom in a little bit at what the chapter says, and then zoom in a little bit more and see what the verse says and look at the kind of words used. So let's do that. So Leviticus is the third book in the Bible. It's the kind of laws that governed the people of Israel at the time, and it's typically split into three different sections as we understand it. There are the civil laws, the ceremonial laws, and the moral laws. The civil laws were kind of the laws of the land and the punishments for breaking those laws, because Israel here was a nation, and so in the same way that the UK has laws or the USA has laws, so Israel had laws. But also in the same way that the laws of the USA are not binding on me because I live in the UK, so it is with these laws, that we don't live under the theocracy of ancient Israel, and so the civil laws are not binding on us in the 21st century. Then we get to the ceremonial laws, and this is to do with whether you were ceremonially pure, whether you were able to come into the presence of God for worship, and things that made you impure were contamination with things that related to mortality, so things like death and blood and disease and infections. And then the ceremonial laws kind of outline, okay, how long you have to wait and how you become pure again, and the role of the priests and sacrifices and all of that sort of stuff. But Jesus says in Matthew 5:17 that he has come to fulfill the law, and so for us, we believe that Jesus makes us ceremonially pure so that we can come into God's presence anytime, and so that kind of does away with those laws. In the same way that the beta version of a video game or the prototype of a product, it does for a while, you use it for a while, but whenever the full and the real thing comes out, then you don't need the previous version anymore. It becomes obsolete. That is what the ceremonial law is. Then we get to the moral laws, and these are just things that are good or things that are bad. They come out of God's character, they stem from his will and his purpose for the world, and they get repeated in the New Testament. So these things don't change. These are just God's rules for all people. So hopefully that helps you understand why some of the laws in Leviticus are followed and some aren't. Now, let's zoom in a little bit and look at the chapter. Now, looking at chapters 18 and chapter 20, they both, along with chapters 17 and 19 and 21, they begin with the words, "The Lord said to Moses." And so it's implied that the bits in those chapters are a kind of unified, coherent thought, and the stuff said in those chapters and about those chapters relates to the whole thing. And that's really important because whenever we look at chapter 18, there's a long list of sexual relations that are prohibited to the people of Israel, but then at the end, from verses 24 to 30, God says this. He says, "Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled." It goes on for a load more verses, and then it says, "Keep my requirements and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them." So God is saying here at the end of chapter 18, and we also get a similar one in chapter 20, verses 22 to 24, that the things that he has just listed that the people aren't allowed to do, those were done by the previous inhabitants of the land, and those things were wrong for them to do. So God's saying, you're not allowed to do them. And so those things listed are wrong, not because they're part of the ceremonial law or the civil law, they're wrong because they go against God's created order. And all of that helps us to understand, I think, the nastier sounding parts of those homosexuality verses. So for example, do we kill people for homosexuality? No. In the same way that we don't put rebellious children to death. That was part of the civil law. doesn't apply anymore. Now, another thing to note here is that the thing that is being prohibited is the act of same-sex relations and not the feeling of same-sex attraction. That is a really, really important distinction. It's something I think we'll maybe talk about in a future video on this topic, so subscribe so that you don't miss that, I guess, if you want to. That's really important, but we'll come back to that another time. Now, getting to the word detestable / abomination, as some versions put it, that is a really triggering word. I get that. It's a word that's used, though, 118 times in the Old Testament. And so it's not just reserved for same-sex relationships, but I think it does convey something of the seriousness of sin. Like, the reality is that sin is way worse than you or I could ever imagine. And if we saw sin from God's perspective, if we saw it the way that He sees it, then we would agree and we would be like, yeah, God, sin is detestable. But that kind of makes me think, how great must the love and the mercy of God be that even whenever we were doing things that were detestable to Him, He chose to make a path to reconciliation at such a great cost to Himself. Yeah, it's kind of cool. Now, look, as with all of these conversations, there is a lot more that could be said. I plan to say some more, but I'm always very quick to point people back with everything, I guess, to the Garden of Eden, so I will do the same now. If you haven't seen my Garden of Eden video on this, then you can tap it here. That should be interesting for you and give some insights. But for now, thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit it with a like, and I will see you in the next one. God bless.